Aloha and welcome to the final lecture for anthropology. This lecture will cover the Schultz and Lavenda Chapter 3, Ethnographic Fieldwork, and also the article Grief and a Headhunter's Rage by Renato Rosaldo. So in Chapter 3, Schultz and Lavenda introduce us to the issues that are inherent in ethnographic fieldwork. And what we're talking about here is basically, we're talking about participant observation. Yeah, to do field work in anthropology, we become participant observers, and the reason for this is because there's no objective information in anthropology. Instead, we have to construct the meanings of what we're looking at here, and we do so with this holistic research method known as participant observation. In which the anthropologists will immerse themselves as deeply as possible into the culture and among those who are part of that culture, to live and to everything, eat, sleep, everything, with the folks that he's studying as part of the culture that he's studying or she's studying. So it's not just it's not about renting a hotel room in Cameroon where you want to do your research or whatever. It's about being placed with the family there. It's about participating as closely as possible in every aspect of daily life in this culture, because that's when you have the best insights and the best chances to sort of to discuss the things that you're seeing and the way things are happening. It doesn't work better any other way for an anthropologist. And remember, of course, this comes from holism. This is this notion that we can't break culture down into its component parts and understand it that way. Yeah. So ethnographic field work involves the holistic research method of participant observation. And so because we have to immerse ourselves, the anthropologist has to immerse themselves as deeply as they can into this culture, they're going to have to deal with a period of adjustment. And depending on how foreign this culture is to theirs and that sort of thing, what experiences they have, it might be easier for them or it might be more difficult. And the more odd it feels and the more you're sort of struggling to comprehend the meanings and you feel like you don't understand what's going on, the more likely you're going to experience what they call culture shock. And this is an anxiety reaction basically that occurs when you're no longer surrounded by the familiar, and everything that you thought you understood about the world is suddenly different because you're in a different culture. So typically, anthropologists, when they begin their ethnographic field work, they start off with a set of questions that come from certain assumptions about the culture and about the way that it works and such. Because those questions are coming from an outsider point of view and coming without that depth of understanding, it's very likely that as the anthropologist does their ethnographic field work, that their assumptions are going to change. As their understanding increases of the culture, the questions that they might want to ask will change, because they can realize, what are worthy questions to ask from the inside rather than the outside. And so we'll take a look at that. So anthropologists have had to deal with the problems of positivism and empiricism head on. Yeah. Anthropology grew out of the positivist tradition of the natural sciences, right? And this is positivistic science. So what does that mean? Well, anthropology back in the 1800s and such was an attempt by philosophers, basically by rich white men, to try and use the positivistic science method to understand other cultures. Yeah. So what does that mean? Well, we're talking about an understanding of the world and an understanding of other people that is based on materialism. Yeah, that there is one reality. In positivism, there's one objective truth. There is one reality. All science basically is trying to understand that objective truth. Yeah, and we believe that this reality is available to our human senses. It is not hidden in some universe of forms, or heaven, or any other place. Yeah, reality is what is here. It's the material that we are dealing with, and we can understand it using our human senses. Positivism is also factual, right? Because they want to separate fact and what we know, what we call objective knowledge, right? From anything else, from values, from religion, from desires about how things ought to be. Positivism says it. It's not a question of whether you like the information or you don't like the information. We just want to understand it based on its objective value. Yeah. And then finally, positivism is a form of empiricism, and that means basically that you use the empirical methods of observation and experimentation. That is how you identify objective truth as a positivist. So to do that, then, as an anthropologist, to follow these positivism, or these rules of positivism, you are working basically to produce objective knowledge about a culture, and that's where they basically ran into a roadblock, because how do you say something is objective when what you're doing really is subjective? You're studying another group of folks based on your personal background and history and culture and that sort of thing. Yeah. So there was a huge problem that anthropologists face just trying to apply the natural science method to social science work and to understanding human beings. So they had to recognize that positivism wasn't going to get them the answers or teach them how to understand humanity, and they had to reach out for something else. So a good example is Margaret Mead's work with Four Societies, where she was comparing gender roles. That's called a controlled comparison. So what they were doing basically in the early days of anthropology is to try and be as objective as possible, and to look at societies that are as similar as possible with only one or two differences and compare those differences, right? So Margaret Mead was trying to look at four societies that appeared fairly similar except for their gender roles. Yeah, and she wanted to talk about what she was specifically looking for is there any culture where gender roles are reversed compared to Western culture? Pardon me. So, she's, and the anthropologists of the time are working to produce ethnographies that are as objective as possible. So they're talking about things such as rites of passage, and life and death, and survival, starvation, and all these kinds of things in an extremely kind of objective way. But that means basically there's a lot of detail but almost no sensitivity. So they're sort of talking about this, but there's no sense that it was sad when this person died, or the famine causes pain and that sort of thing. And if you're trying to be empirical, then you must be objective. If you want to be objective, then you should not talk about things like emotion and hurt and that sort of stuff, right? So of course that led them down a dead end road. Yeah, anthropologists recognize that this pretense at objectivity is really a failure to truly identify what's really going on, and the methods that demand objectivity, therefore, are suited for certain things but not for others, and specifically not for the study of culture and the study of humanity. So if not empiricism, if not positive methods, then what do we do instead? Well, the notion of the anthropologists basically had to go back and look at it from the ground up. What do we consider to be reality? Yeah, what is objective reality? And is there really a place for that when we're talking about subjective entities, when we're talking about human beings and things like that? So they came up with, or generally basically through the years, basically we came to a kind of conclusion that rather than seek objectivity, we must seek reflexivity. Yeah, and what that means is basically a critical analysis of the processes that we are going through when we're trying to understand another culture. Yeah. So, someone who's thinking reflexively will think, what am I thinking about this event, about this object, or about this process? And why am I viewing it in such terms? So, for example, someone might watch a football game and say, "Yay, my team won and the other team lost," and hooray and whatever. But to think about it reflexively is to bring some critical analysis to what they're thinking. Why do I value this team over that team? What exactly is the true difference? Is it really the people that are different? Is it the geographic location between teams? Is it the people who own the teams? Is it my thoughts about those geographic locations? All those kinds of things. What am I thinking about when I'm thinking about this? Yeah, that's reflexivity. So it involves not just thinking about your basic things in life, like where am I going to get my dinner from, or what am I going to do this weekend for fun or whatever. It involves thinking about the context of your life, yeah, about where you are in terms of history and in terms of society, yeah. What aspects of my personal culture, my personal history, my personal experience are influencing my analysis and understanding of this issue that I'm studying, yeah. So, we can look at, we can ask ourselves these questions about this process that we want to understand this other culture, but we need to sort of understand, why we're going through this process. What are the questions that we're asking? Why do we feel that these are the important questions? And we want to encourage our cultural informants to do the same thing. That's why the slide's titled Mutual Reflexivity. Because the best cultural informants are those who think reflexively about their own lives and think about, why am I doing this now, and what are the forces at play here, that sort of thing. So, for example, your text has the Betty Lou Valentine bit where they talk about how she included in her ethnography a final chapter of comment and conclusions where she went out and sought her informants, responses to her conclusions, and also asked them to basically tell her, where do you feel I went wrong and why, and those sorts of things. And she included those into her ethnography of Blackston. This, she had worked with Charles, her husband, as well on this ethnography. So, with the idea being that there's no objective truth. Right? There's no objective truth about, is one football team better than the other, or that sort of thing. But what there is we can think about it critically. We can think about the meaning of this stuff. We can think about why we do the things that we do, and how we're influenced to do those things by our social context and our historical context and those sorts of things. So, when I said that there's no objective knowledge, that is the heart and soul now of anthropology. Anthropologists will not seek objective knowledge of a culture because it's assumed that it does not exist. There is no one right culture, and there is no one right perspective on culture. So instead, then, rather than saying my view is right, we must construct or negotiate what things mean. Yeah. So what that means basically is that any anthropologist who's attempting to understand another culture has to go through a process of negotiating meaning with their cultural informants. Yeah. Because basically the meaning of what you're studying can be different depending on who you're asking and where you are and even the historical time period and all that sort of thing. So your text talks about the dialectic of field work. Dialectic refers to this process that human beings go to. It's called an interpretive process where we're trying to understand forces that appear to that are both causal yet seem contradictory. Yeah. So, for example, things like understanding the self and the other. Yeah, when you're doing anthropology, you're trying to understand the other, the cultural other. Yeah, we're trying to understand, other groups and things like that. But to do so, we have to, as the quote goes, build a bridge of understanding between ourself and the other. Yeah, the dialectic refers to these sort of notions that there are these dual opposing forces. There's me and everyone else. There is the notion of, let's say, the raw versus the cooked. Yeah, the nature, which is unbridled and impulsive and powerful and uncontrolled, versus culture, which is ruled and organized and structured, those sorts of things. Yeah. So, dialectic of fieldwork refers to, in part, this notion that we're trying to negotiate meaning, we're trying to develop an understanding, and in doing so, this new understanding, this becomes sort of a hybrid that didn't actually exist before. They're coming up with new meanings, new understandings of cultural events and that kind of thing that grows out of this interpretive process, this working with cultural informants and thinking critically about the issues around this aspect that they're studying. So in field work, we've got to do both interpretation and translation. Yeah, and when I'm talking about interpretation, I'm not talking about interpreting language. It's how do we interpret what other people are doing, and how do we interpret why they're doing that. Yeah. So here in our own culture, we have a basic system that's called folk psychology, right? Each culture has its own folk psychology that takes the meanings of that culture and uses that to allow us to then predict, yeah, or to understand why people did that. This person pulled into McDonald's because they're hungry and they want food, yeah, or whatever, that sort of thing. Of course, this really only works in our own culture because we're familiar with the meanings of behaviors in our culture and we can apply our folk psychology. But when we're trying to interpret the actions of others, yeah, and the ideas, what's going on inside them, especially when we're doing it in another culture, that can be almost impossible because of our ethnocentrism, because of our lack of familiarity with the rules and the hidden meanings and things in another culture. So interpretation of that other culture then becomes this task of trying to comprehend that our own cultural self via coming to understand the cultural other. And what that means basically is, in our effort to understand these individual cultural beings that are our informants in a society, we're also learning about ourselves and the role that we play, our cultural role, and what makes, what influences of culture have built upon us as we're doing this. Yeah, so we're learning about ourselves as we're learning about the other culture, because it's almost impossible not to start, turning those questions around and asking yourself, well, why do I do things this way? Yeah, and those sorts of things, right? So there's this dialectic of field work, right? We've got both ourself and the other. We've got both interpretation and translation. We've got both, language and behavior. There's all these different dualities that we're having to come to grips with and deal with and figure out how they work together. Yeah. So your text also talks about intersubjective meaning. And this is a term that comes to us from philosophy that describes a condition or a situation that's basically somewhere between subjectivity and objectivity. What that means is basically it's a situation that is personally experienced by more than one individual. So, for example, culture is intersubjective. Why? Because it's personally experienced by all members, yeah, but that personal experience is subjective. What that means is, the meaning of that experience can be different based on our personal experience. Yeah. So let's say, for example, a wedding. Yeah. You go to a wedding and you may look around at different people at the wedding and such, and you might ask each different person, what is the meaning of this event? What's going on here? Yeah. And each person might have a little bit of a different way of explaining it. For the person, for the waiter or the caterer, that sort of thing. Oh, It's these people who are joining together in holy matrimony and giving me a job. Yeah. For maybe the brother or the sister of the groom or the bride or that sort of thing, it's I'm getting a new family member. My family's getting bigger, and so on and so forth. And this could necessarily be a good thing, or maybe they can't stand the person that their brother or sister is marrying, and maybe it's a sad event for them. Yeah. Yeah, a wedding's supposed to be a happy, joyous occasion, and so on and so forth. Does that mean that everyone experiences it the same way? No, it does not. Yeah. Any event, any object, any ceremony, any process, anything in culture the meaning of it can be different depending on the individual who is in there, experiencing that ceremony, experiencing that event, or viewing that object or whatever it may be, because of what they bring to the situation. Yeah. Therefore, meaning of anything, the meaning of that painting, the meaning of that movie, the meaning of somebody flipping the bird to somebody else, the meaning of someone getting hired or fired, all depends, on the context of the participant. So it's not just what it means in general. This is a wedding where people are joining together, but it's also each one of those individual meanings. And the more the anthropologist can understand all these different meanings, that come into play in any cultural event or so on and so forth, the stronger we can understand that event or that object or that ceremony or whatever it may be. So some examples here. Self-presentation is a good example of intersubjectivity, right? When you get dressed and you go to work and someone asks you in the morning, hey, how are you doing? You don't typically, spill your guts out to them and say, oh, I'm working so hard and I'm so tired and, I bounced a check last week and so on and so forth. You say, I'm doing good. I'm raring to go. I'm ready to make this stuff happen and do a good job and so on and so forth. Yeah. Does that mean that one is false and one is true? Not necessarily. Yeah. But we're trying to present, what we know works in our culture, right? It doesn't work to complain and be a sad sack and that sort of thing. You're going to get ostracized. You're going to get ignored. No one cares. No one really wants to know how you're doing when they ask you how you're doing. They're just being polite. So, we have this notion of self-presentation that we don't walk around and wear our heart on our sleeve all the time. Yeah. And so there basically, when we're saying we feel good, we may not feel good. Yeah. There's two different meanings going on there. Yeah. There's a shared sort of divergence of meaning. I'll give you another example. When you're telling a lie, right? Like, let's say you've got a hangover and your boss asks you, how are you doing this morning? And you say, I'm doing really good, sir. Or I'm doing really good, ma'am. Yeah. You're lying, right? Because you're working with two different definitions of the situation. Yeah. With what you want to present to your boss. Yeah. You want your boss to know that, you are committed to this job and you are committed to the firm and you're doing a good job and so on and so forth. Yeah. But you also can't tell them, geez, I really overdid it last night. I'm not at my peak performance and so on and so forth, those sorts of things, right? So you've got to figure out, what do I express to them and what do I not express? In that situation, you've got two different definitions of reality and both are valid. Yeah. Another example, something that happened to me recently was watching UFC, mixed martial art fight. And a guy gets knocked out by a kick, and at almost the exact same time, the two commentators say two very different things. One says, "What a beautiful kick," yeah, and the other one says, "What a devastating kick," yeah. So we've got two different definitions of what happened. That was a devastating kick. It was a beautiful kick. Is one more right than the other? Not necessarily. Yeah, because what we've got here are two subjective definitions of that kick. Yeah, and so one is coming from this technical standpoint that says this person had used perfect form, and their kinesthetics were appropriate, and so on and so forth, and the form of the kick was beautiful. Yeah. Another person watching the exact same thing can say it doesn't. I don't care about the form of the kick. What mattered was the kick had this effect, and it was devastating. Yeah, we're both talking about the same thing, this kick, but we can see it in two very different ways and have two very different beliefs about what that is. Yeah, and that's intersubjective meaning. That's the fact that there is, it is a beautiful kick. It was a devastating kick. Neither one of those is true to the exclusion of the other. They're both right. So here's some examples for you of meaning and that sort of thing. Yeah, this is a gentleman from New Guinea, and this is a gentleman who has scars on this on the left hand side. This is the front of his chest, and on the right hand side, this is his back. So as you can see, these are not accidental scars. These are scars that were made on purpose to develop a pattern. Yeah. So this happens in the Chambry Lakes area in New Guinea. This is basically the rite of passage to adulthood for males. Once they're assumed to be strong enough and mature enough, they undergo what's called a scarification ritual. Now, the scarification ritual to outsiders is brutal. It is bloody. It looks extremely painful, which it is. People pass out because what they're doing basically is they used to use sharp rocks, but now they use razor blades. And each one of these marks is a cut in the skin, a cut that has to be deep enough to prevent healing right away. Yeah. And then I think they actually put something on the cut to prevent it from healing as well. So the point being here is that if you were to come upon this village during their rite of passage, what you would see is several young men being held down and cut hundreds, if not thousands of times all over their body while they're writhing in pain and screaming in pain and that sort of thing. Now, to the uninitiated, you're going to see that and you're going to say this is some sort of punishment. Here are people who, this is some sort of savage group that disfigures its criminals or whatever, and does this horrible act to them instead of imprisonment or one thing or another. But this is actually desired. Yeah, you have status once you have these. And by the way, I don't know if you can notice, but basically what these scars are supposed to resemble is an alligator. Yeah, in the front, these are the alligator's eyes on this picture on the left hand side, and around the navel is the alligator's nose. Yeah, and the back, the gentleman's back, is basically supposed to represent the alligator's back and the hide of the alligator. Yeah, so this is a brutal and horrific ceremony, but it's one that young men desire and want to have happen to them, and they want to go and be able to show the scars for the rest of their life. Now, does that then mean that it's not an incredibly bloody and painful thing? No, that's true as well. Yeah. So the truth is open-ended. Yeah, it's multifaceted. Yeah. So yes, they go through this bloody, what appears to be torture to the outsider. Yeah, but it is one that you only get through reaching a certain status and reaching a certain age, and it is one that then makes them feel whole and complete. So, we're trying to understand this, trying to understand that cultural other and through our cultural self and that sort of thing. And we're dealing with basically all of these dualities in nature and in our world and in our experience. Yeah. The dialectic of field work means that we have to interpret between ourselves or between anthropologists as active agents in the process and cultural informants who are also active agents in the process of this culture. Yeah. So they give us the example of Daniel Bradford with the Comanche in Iran. I think that's on page 42. And, they're trying to understand why this nomadic tribe, says, today's not a good day to move, we'll move tomorrow. The next day comes along and they say, today's not a good day to move, we'll go tomorrow. Yeah. And he says, well, why is today not a good day to move? And they would say, Razakwab. Yeah. And what that means is day of the scorpion. So, it takes them a long time to understand that it's not literally the day of the scorpion. It's not only because Scorpio is in the constellation Scorpio in the sky is pointing in a certain direction and that sort of thing. But it's really that Razakwab is basically a cultural term for a situation where we don't have to go yet. Yeah, they're basically saying decision does not need to be made. It doesn't mean we'll go tomorrow. Yeah, it's a little bit like, and I don't want to confuse you, but this notion of mañana in Spanish. Yeah, where it means later. It doesn't necessarily mean tomorrow. It doesn't necessarily mean the day after. It just means not now. Yeah, Razakwab. Same thing goes for the Comanche tribe. Yeah. So what he learned basically is that here they've developed basically this understanding that we need to minimize the risks that are inherent in living in this nasty desert, right? So to do so, in part, we need to hold off making decisions until it's absolutely imperative, until we must make a choice. Yeah. And in doing so, that makes the choice much clearer. Yeah. So it's a mutual activity between the anthropologist and the informant. Yeah. They're both active agents. The informant is active in getting their needs met and trying to make the world the way that they want it to be, or trying to get a house for their family or whatever it may be, goats for their farm, so on and so forth. And the anthropologist is trying to understand what they're doing and asking and negotiating and asking them, tell me what you think about, what do you mean when you say Razakwab? What does that mean to you? That kind of thing, right? So this sort of process does not produce old information. Yeah. What happens is basically this mutual interaction develops into hybrid knowledge. Yeah, this is new knowledge that didn't come only from one culture. It's from this mutual interaction and the shared understanding and experience. Yeah, that allows us then to come up with new knowledge about meanings and about functions. Yeah. Pardon me. So, as we said, meaning cannot be objective. It has to be intersubjective. So what that means then is that to understand the meaning of any ceremony or event or whatever, that meaning has to be constructed. It has to be negotiated among those involved. Yeah. So, for example, we want to understand, like you might ask, you might be an anthropologist and want to understand why someone played a practical joke on someone else. Yeah. Well, you're going to get two different answers from the person who played the joke and from the person who got the joke played on them, right? And same thing goes, giving a person who's asking for money, why did you give that person $1? And their response and the meaning of what they did might be very different for them versus the person who got the dollar versus the person who's observing, that sort of thing. So here's an example of that constructing meaning. We see, or this, basically that there's no objective meaning. Yeah. So we have Jean Briggs, who went and lived among the Utku Inuits. Yeah, and she was adopted as a daughter and brought into their culture and given intimate access to the Utku way of life. Now, so she's basically having to live two different roles. She's having to live the role of anthropologist in this culture, but also you take on a responsibility when you join a family, right? And so she recognizes that not only is she sort of dealing with these two conflicting roles as she understands them, but she's also dealing with the different meanings of the parent-child roles between cultures. Yeah, and she recognizes basically that she's got this conflict between her understanding of parent-child roles from her culture and their exhibition of parent-child roles, as they're living it out. Yeah, so she's recognizing, geez, it's very hard to be an anthropologist and an adopted daughter at the same time, especially when the role of daughter is so different. Yeah, and this is sort of a dialectic process here, where she sees, I'm having to deal with these two conflicting, aspects, right, of being the professional and being the social scientist, but also being the daughter, and what does that mean? In terms of being a daughter here in this culture, and also what does that mean from her personal culture, from her American culture? Yeah. So it forces anthropologists to deal with these with these great kind of philosophical implications and such. Yeah. Because they're living it. Yeah. It's not just going to a hotel and watching other folks and counting how many people buy a roll at a certain restaurant or one thing or another, because they are immersed in the process, and because they're thinking about it critically, they're able to really kind of have their own assumptions and understandings and meaning brought into stark contrast. And we need to, and then we recognize this meaning is not something that is elemental and enduring. Meaning is something that's constructed based in large part on context. Well, so this is why the natural scientists look at social science and they say, you guys aren't as good as us. You aren't as strong as us. You don't have facts like we do. Yeah, and in physics they have fact. The speed of light is this many miles per second, right? And that is a truth. It remains the same. It is an eternal, apparently objective fact. But we don't have those in anthropology. Yeah, we know that anthropologists collect some sort of data during their field work, and if we take David Hess's definition of a fact as a widely accepted observation or a taken for granted item of common knowledge, then we could say that anthropologists collect factual data. But, when we're talking about most facts, they are not objective. Yeah. And especially when you get to the level of cultural fact, what constitutes a cultural fact is ambiguous. And what I mean by that is that there can be disagreement as to how important this cultural fact is, and even whether or not it's a cultural fact or maybe a temporal fact, or more of a familial fact, yeah, among this family rather than among the culture. So anthropologists in their field work, yeah, will mutually construct new meanings, this hybrid knowledge, yeah, between themselves and their cultural informants. And it's new and it's hybrid because it's mutually constructed across cultural boundaries, right? We've got the anthropologist coming from their culture. We've got the cultural informant coming from theirs, working together to come up with an understanding that doesn't rely on one culture over the other. Yeah. And so in your text, you can see that the process of field work can change not only the knowledge that we think we have, but also the individuals engaged in it, and can change the meanings that individual has held as core values for their entire life. So, the study of humanity cannot be done objectively. Yeah, we cannot do empirical positivist work with human beings. So we must understand human experience from the inside. We must do it not objectively, but intersubjectively. The reason for that is because there's no one true version of human life. All versions are equally valid. So as we learn about other ways of life, we also learn about our own way of life. And we also learn about our own personal life, who we are as an individual. Why did I choose anthropology? Why did I choose this group? Why did I choose this thing to study? All that kind of stuff. And we might even learn something about the limitations that our cultural perspective places upon us. The fact that we come from a certain belief system limits us from necessarily being open to other belief systems. And we get that, we get an illustration of that with Renato Rosaldo's Grief and a Headhunter's Rage. Here's the author on the right-hand side there, and here's a very old, bad picture of Ilongot headhunter individuals here, 4 Ilongot headhunters. And but actually, when you look at them, you can see that none of them have actually collected a head. These 4 gentlemen here have not successfully been headhunting and collected a head. And I'll tell you how I know that in a minute. So Renato Rosaldo is he's basically talking about what he calls emotional force, and that he kind of criticizes anthropology at the time for focusing on the ritual rather than the meaning. He also talks about what's called the positioning of anthropologist and informant, and how interpretation of meaning changes with the positioning of the anthropologist and informant. So we'll talk about those things as we go through the article. So Renato Rosaldo lived with the Ilongot tribe in northeastern Manila in the Philippines for at least 2 years. I think it was 66 through almost 68, and then he came back in 74, something like that. But he started out wanting to study the Ilongot tribe because they were headhunters, and he was interested in headhunting. But as we see in his article, it's this process of trying to understand their explanations of headhunting that leads him to reflect on what he's doing with the Ilongots, and also with the way that anthropology works in general. So how do I know that those 4 guys have not successfully headhunted? Well, because if they had, then they would wear either a red hornbill headdress or red hornbill earrings. And so here we have on the right-hand side, we have an old picture, I think from National Geographic or something, of an Ilongot tribes member with the red hornbill headdress. And what that is red hornbill is a bird, kind of like a toucan, and so it's got a really big red bill, and they use the skull of the bird as a decoration. On the left-hand side, you see this color picture here. You see this young individual wearing this. This is not an Ilongot. What this is instead the ability now to purchase these tribal artifacts. You can actually go online and buy red hornbill headdress, that the Ilongot tribes people make, and now they sell, or other folks make to sell, basically to make money. So now you don't have to go all the way over to Manila in the Philippines and go up to the Ilongots and ask them for a red hornbill headdress, which they wouldn't give to you unless you were a member of their tribe and you had successfully headhunted. So that's how you can tell, someone who's been through the headhunting. They wear that headdress or the earrings, and if they haven't, then they don't. So Renato goes over to the Ilongots, and as his article talks about, he spent years trying to understand their explanation. His basic question was, why do you go out and cut people's heads off? Their answer is that we cut heads off because of the rage that we feel, yeah, that comes from our grief, right? And that, he just says, what? I don't understand that, yeah. Headhunters, the Ilungut, I don't want to say headhunters, but this Ilungut culture, basically, yeah, they've developed a ritual for bereavement that involves headhunting, yeah, and it comes from the emotional force of loss, especially of traumatic loss, yeah. So their answer is that we go out and we hide and we wait for another human to come by, and a member of a different tribe, not the Ilungut tribe, and we jump out and we attack them and we cut their head off, because we're hoping to vent and to get rid of the anger of our bereavement. Yeah. So when they cut someone's head off, they don't then take that head home and shrink it or use it as a salt and pepper shaker, or make it put it on the mantle or whatever. That's not what it's for. When they cut that head off, they throw that head away and they walk away. Yeah. It's not about showing how strong they are. It's not about taking another person's life. Yeah. It's about venting their grief, venting their anger. Yeah. So Rosaldo could not understand this conception because he had no personal experience of devastating loss. He was not positioned to understand their explanation. It made no sense to him, even though his own brother had died. Yeah, it wasn't the kind of visceral, abrupt loss that causes this bereavement anger. Yeah. So it wasn't until he had his own personal tragedy that repositioned him and gave him that insight into the power of grief. And so, he's talking about the emotional force of death. And, he talks about, there's the abstract notion of death, that is, when people stop breathing and their heart stops pumping and so on and so forth. But it is nowhere near, it does not have the emotional force as when you realize you're talking about your death or the death of someone close to you. Yeah. He says it's that difference between seeing someone get hit by a car and then realizing that someone is a member of your family. Yeah. It's one thing for someone to die that you're not connected to and that sort of thing. It could be a horrible tragedy and such, but it is nowhere near as visceral. It is nowhere near as intense as when it is your reality that is being ruptured, when it is your understanding of the world. My father will always be here. My brother will always be here. My wife, that sort of thing. And to have them suddenly, abruptly, and as viscerally as possible, pulled from your world. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. That's what he's talking about with the emotional force of death. So he says, when we're trying to understand any aspect of humanity, we want to understand not just the ritual. Yeah, it's not just enough to understand bereavement ritual that tells us basically, when someone dies, we get them a tombstone and we put them in a coffin and we hold a ceremony, and then we take them to the graveyard and we bury them, or we burn their ashes and we scatter them, or one thing, or whatever it may be, right? But the idea is basically that we are, that anthropology, his criticism is anthropology fails to do that, to recognize the power and to encapsulate that emotional experience. Yeah. He says they fail to do so because it's easier just to do the quick and easy of looking at the ceremony. Yeah. We'll talk about that in a minute. So we're trying to understand, he's saying part of understanding humanity is understanding our emotional experience. Yeah. And our ability to negotiate meaning and to understand that is partially based on our perceptions, our interpretations of the culture or event or whatever it is, and the perceptions and interpretations of our cultural informants, right? So all these interpretations are provisional. And what that means is they aren't necessarily 100% accurate. They can always change. These interpretations can change because all of our interpretations are made by us as positioned subjects. What that means by position is we are prepared to know certain things and not others. Yeah? Because of our life history, because of our education, and so on and so forth. There are certain things that we can grasp and we can understand, and other things that we can't. So, for example, Rosato was not positioned to understand the notion of anger and death until his wife fell from a cliff. Yeah, and he finds, they call him, and he gets brought there, and she is dead on the ground, and he suddenly is overcome with not just grief but rage, with anger. How could she leave me? How could she be so stupid to risk her life in such a way? Yeah. So he suddenly got this insight. He's been repositioned now. Yeah. That, sometimes death isn't this nice, tidy, pretty little thing where, we close the casket and we say our goodbyes and everything's good. Yeah. That, for, in some instances, death is sudden and it is visceral and it is not something that you have a chance to come to terms with. It is a rupture of your reality. It is 1 minute your loved one is with you and everything is fine. The next minute they're gone and they're never coming back. Yeah. And so he's saying that it's something that you cannot explain to someone else. Yeah, we can't necessarily reposition ourselves by going out and reading a book on death. Yeah, it's something that either happens to us or it doesn't. Yeah, we either have this experience, we get this insight, or we don't. So then he goes on to criticize anthropological method in general. He says, that what we're doing in anthropology is trying to fit events and experience into an orderly process that's easy to encapsulate. Yeah, but this orderly process cannot capture the breadth of the experience. Yeah. So the example, he gives us many different examples of the different funeral rites and the studies and looking at, these the funeral rites in different societies and what they do when there's a death and that sort of thing. And he says that anthropologists will focus on the ritual, the funeral ritual, yeah, because it's easy, because it's linear. You can identify when it starts and stops. You can say these are the people who are in there, and so on and so forth, right? So we can talk about funeral as a ceremony, yeah, that is engaged in during bereavement, yeah. But to say that when someone dies, we go through a funeral and that's it, that misses the force of bereavement, the emotional force of coping with loss, yeah. So he says anthropologists who are doing that, who are just looking at these ceremonies and using these ceremonies and actually cleaning them up, sort of ignoring when maybe a family member faints during the eulogy and or people cry out or that sort of thing. They're missing the depth of the culture. Yeah. So he talks a little bit about cultural force. He's saying cultural force are those things that have the power to shape what we do. Yeah. And so for example, bereavement rage is a cultural force among the Ilunga. It is the notion that this is what happens when someone dies. Yeah, our grief is also rage. Yeah, because oftentimes, especially for these folks living in the Philippines, they didn't have hospitals, they didn't have medicine and things like that. Death was oftentimes something that was sudden and that was you don't take a person to a hospital and go visit them every other day or whatever. They're with you. You are caring for them. You are watching them as they slip away. Yeah. So bereavement rage is a cultural force among the Ilongot. It is what basically shapes their conduct. And when someone dies, then it's accepted that they are going to have this sense of rage and that they must go out and they must cut off a head and vent and throw that rage away. So Rosato's saying that anytime you're looking at anthropological fact or knowledge or whatever, it's never static. It's always open-ended. It's always subject to revision. The reason for that is because the positioning of the anthropologist and the positioning of their informants can change throughout the period of field work and even through the subsequent writing of the ethnography. Yeah. So because this positioning can change, we don't want to say, well, this is why the Ilongots do their headhunting, period, end of story, right? We have an understanding, thanks to Rosato, about those powerful emotions that occur for them, and that it's this notion that your bereavement in part is anger, and that you must vent this anger. Yeah. So we've got this idea now, but things can change, right? The Ilongots, no longer headhunt. They can't headhunt because nowadays they'll get arrested. Yeah. So they've got to find other cultural ways of dealing with their bereavement and those sorts of things, and that's part of the notion that the positioning of informants will always is always capable of changing. So you should always consider not only your own positioning as an anthropologist, but those that of your informants and the interpretations that are based on those positions. Yeah, that hey, I'm just a 35-year-old guy from the Bronx, New York, or whatever, and maybe I don't understand everything or have enough knowledge to even start contemplating what this system is or what's going on here. Yeah, so. There's always the possibility for repositioning. There's always the possibility for new hybrid knowledge. And that'll do it for this final lecture in anthropology. As always, if you have any questions about the lecture or the readings, feel free to send me an email or give me a call. And we'll see you on the next lecture. Hui ho.